What's up guys, today I have my very first video for Chongyun. He's a character that I've had built for ages now, but never actually got around to making a guide for him. One of my goals for this channel is to have at least one guide for every character, and today I'm finally going to give the channel the Chongyun video it deserves. He's a super nice unit to build that provides a lot of damage with his cheap elemental burst, similar to the way that Aloy can be played. Throughout the patches to Genshin Impact, he's only gotten better as more build options have been introduced. As always, my guides will cover the latest and best artifacts, weapons, and team comps to use with Chongyun. Without further ado, let's get this guide rolling. Before I talk about artifacts and weapons, let's talk about Chongyun's strengths and weaknesses. For his strengths, the biggest upside of Chongyun is definitely going to be his cheap elemental burst. This thing has a 12-second cooldown, 40 energy cost, and a huge multiplier of 683% at talent level 8. And that's not even including the extra damage from his C6. His elemental burst is the bread and butter of his kit, and we want to build Chongyun in a way that we can have the most damage from this burst and have it ready every time it comes off cooldown. All of the 3 swords that Chongyun's burst calls down can melt off of a single pyro application from a character like Bennett, which only makes his high damage multipliers even better. However, with C6, it's a nice thing to keep in mind that the 4th blade summoned from the C6 effect will not melt since the pyro will be removed before the 4th hit. Another strength of Chongyun is his cryo infusion from his elemental skill. We can enable characters to get a ton of melt reactions like Diluc, Bennett, or Xiangling, and we can also grant cryo attacks to cryo characters such as Rosaria or Kaya. If you have Chongyun C2, this cryo infusion field can also grant cooldown reduction, which is definitely useful, and it's one of the rarest buffs in the game currently. However, Chongyun's biggest weakness is also his cryo infusion. Having the ability to change melee characters' attacks into cryo definitely limits his team options. You'll notice that Chongyun will shine in specific teams but will rarely be used outside of these certain teams. In summary, what I want you to take away from this brief breakdown of Chongyun should be that he's mainly going to be spamming his elemental burst off cooldown and supporting his teammates with off-field cryo infusion. Kicking off the main guide with artifact sets, Chongyun is really just your run-of-the-mill burst DPS character. His best in slot is going to be the classic combination of the 2-set Blizzard Strayer with the 2-set Noblesse Oblige. Chongyun's elemental burst is his main source of damage, as I mentioned before, and this set is the standard option for bolstering that damage. As for other options, I also like to recommend the full 4-set Noblesse. The reason why this set is so highly valued on Chongyun is because he can have a consistent uptime on the buff with his 12-second cooldown and 40 energy cost burst. Other popular characters of the full 4-set Noblesse like Diona or Bennett do suffer a tiny bit of downtime because their elemental burst cooldowns are longer than 12 seconds. The 4-set Emblem of Severed Fate is also a viable option on Chongyun despite his 40 energy cost burst. While the conditions of this set aren't exactly ideal, they definitely do not hurt Chongyun either. Even with just 150% energy recharge, which is more than enough ER for Chongyun, you still get a sizable amount of bonus burst damage. However, I do want to warn that this set is heavily contested and needed amongst a ton of other characters. With that in mind, you shouldn't be prioritizing getting Chongyun on this set over other characters that you're building like Beidou or Xiangling. I just wanted to mention this 4-set as an alternative in case anyone does happen to have pieces available for Chongyun. Beyond that, any combination of the 2 sets on screen right now are also going to be viable options to choose from. If you happen to have incredible substats on some Gladiator or Shimenawa pieces, for example, then by all means use it on Chongyun. Balanced stats are extremely important, and there's nothing wrong with running something like 2 Glad and 2 Noblesse or 2 Blizzard Strayer if you have pieces with tons of crit. As for artifact stats, the Hourglass wants attack percent or EM, the Goblet wants cryo damage bonus, and the Circlet wants crit rate or crit damage. The Circlet and Goblet are pretty self-explanatory, but keep in mind that EM in the Sand slot is a very specific choice and is typically only used when Chongyun is in teams like the original national team with Xiangling and Bennett. Generally, attack percent should be the go-to option for the Sand slot, but in certain scenarios where you have multiple sources of attack percent, like the Pyro Resonance, Bennett's attack buff, or an attack percent weapon, then Elemental Mastery is a better option in the Sands for huge melt damage. As for artifact substats, we want to focus the normal crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, EM, and energy recharge. Same thing here as in the main stats, you don't want EM if you're running Chongyun on a freeze team, but if you are running Chongyun for reverse melt, then EM does serve as a good substat. Moving into weapons, this is where we have the biggest changes since Genshin Impact's early days. There have been a ton more claymore options that have been introduced that Chongyun can definitely utilize, and I want to cover all these options in order from best to worst. Starting out with Chongyun's best in slot, we have the Wolf's Gravestone. This weapon has been here upon release, and it's just a pure stat stick for attack percent, and that's pretty much all we need for Chongyun, honestly. However, we can't overlook the supportive passive either. Chongyun can easily proc the passive with his high damage multipliers and grant the party a ton of attack by bringing an enemy to low HP. This of course is always going to be welcomed on a supportive DPS that is mainly focused on quickly switching in and out. At the number 2 spot we have Serpent Spine. This low budget BP option is an absolute blessing to players who are trying to build Chongyun. Not only does the weapon give a ton of crit rate, but the passive is really easy to abuse because Chongyun will rarely get hit since he doesn't spend a lot of time on the field. For the 3rd and 4th spots we have Scoured Pride and the Unforged. First off, Scoured Pride matches Chongyun's aesthetic a ton, which is always a plus in my books. But looks aside, Scoured Pride gives Chongyun a ton of base attack and even some energy recharge so that you don't really need to focus ER in artifact stats at all. The Unforged is still good on Chongyun as a claymore, but the passive is pretty much useless in most situations, and the weapon is completely outclassed by Wolf's Gravestone. In the number 5 spot we have the brand new 4-star claymore Akuo Maru. This weapon is extremely interesting and performs extremely well with higher refinements. Under certain teams where you have more than 180 energy cost bursts like the original national team with Xiangling and Xingqiu, you can get insane value out of the weapon's passive. Right below Akuo Maru, we have the Luxurious Sea Lord, which is our completely free-to-play option for Chongyun. This weapon was introduced previously in patch 2.1, and this weapon gives Chongyun exactly what he wants with the extra elemental burst damage. However, this weapon is pretty much outclassed if you happen to have Akuo Maru with high refinements. At number 7 we have the Lithic Blade, which is one of my personal favorite weapons on Chongyun. At first glance, this weapon is just another attack percent claymore, but what distinguishes it from the other options is that the unique passive can grant Chongyun as much crit rate as Serpent Spine at R5. While this sounds nice, the weapon does need Liuya characters to function at full potential. That means aside from the original national team, this weapon does not have much of a use, and the other 4-star options like Akuo Maru or Luxurious Sea Lord perform with much more consistency. And lastly, at number 8 we have the Sacrificial Greatsword. This option is specifically for teams that need better uptime on Chongyun's Crow infusions such as Rosaria or Kaya freeze teams. You can even think outside the box and use this weapon to combat specific enemies like the pesky Abyss Lectors or Abyss Heralds. Beyond that, there are a few more weapon options that I'm going to show on screen right now because they're still decent on Chongyun. While these claymores are still viable, the introduction of newer weapons make these ones just not as good as they used to be. Before we get into the last section of this guide, now that you know how to build Chongyun, let's quickly take a look at my own Chongyun build since I know some people may be curious and ask about my own build. Now that you've seen my build, let's talk about the 2 most popular team comps with Chongyun. Of course, this wouldn't be a Chongyun video if I didn't cover the original national team. For those who don't know, this team consists of Chongyun, Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett. I have a guide that's like 17 minutes long that covers everything you need to know about this team, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. If you want to watch that, then I'll have a card in the top right or a link down below in the description. Anyways, the gist of this team is that Chongyun can get huge reverse melt hits on his elemental burst with Bennett, and he can also provide Crow infusion to Xiangling so that she can get huge melt hits with her Pyronado. The damage output on this team is absolutely ridiculous, and if you want a team with all 4-star characters, then this is a staple team that you should definitely consider building. The second team that I want to talk about with Chongyun is going to be a freeze team. This team archetype is a lot more flexible than the national team, and I personally think it's just as fun as well. The team consists of Chongyun, a melee cryo DPS, a hydro support / enabler, and then an Nemo unit that uses the 4-set Viridescent Veneer. For the cryo DPS slot, Rosaria, Kaya, and Ayaka are all stellar options that have their own strengths. Whichever one you pick is completely up to who you already have built or who you like to play the most. As for the hydro unit, we can take our pick between Xingqiu, Kokomi, and Mona. Xingqiu and Mona are common units for a wide variety of teams, and that's no different for a freeze team like this one. Right now, I want to mainly focus on Kokomi because you already know what Mona and Xingqiu do, and I really do think that Kokomi is a little bit slept on as a unit for freeze teams. With the attack buff from the 4-set tenacity of the Millith and energy generation from the weapon prototype Amber, Kokomi becomes one of the best characters to use for a freeze team since she can both buff and enable the main DPS. Of course, this is a very specific build, so you might want to consider whether or not you're willing to make that investment to build Kokomi in this specific way. And last but not least, the Anemo character slot is super flexible, but the character that's a step above the rest is obviously going to be Kazuha. He's the only character with an elemental bonus damage buff for the team at C0, and his kit is simply too good to pass up. Sayu, Jean, Venti, or Sucrose are all around the same level of support for a freeze team, so if you don't have Kazuha, you can take your pick between these 4 characters. And with that, it's time to wrap up the video. If you enjoyed this guide or thought it was useful, be sure to support both the video and the channel. Hopefully I convinced you to maybe build Chongyun if you haven't yet, and other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.